good afternoon. This is Salomon Davila and Deborah Bird here as part of the CCC Maker TAPS. I just wanted to make certain everyone could hear me first. If you can find yourself in the chat window there, let me know if you can hear me. Oh, great, good. For those of you that are joining us for this webinar, there's a couple of ways that you can communicate with us as we go along. There's the chat session, which you can pose a question to everyone or to the panelists being myself and Deborah. So we can monitor the chat window. Yet, if you have a bit more formative question that you would like answered, there is a Q&A box somewhere floating around in your taskbar, and it would be good to place your question there so that we can record the answer and export it to a format that we can then send out to everyone to inquire. I believe the questions only go to the panelists as well, so we will then forward the questions in narrative form after the webinar. Although we will announce the question and answers as best as we can throughout the webinar so that everyone gets to hear it and gets to chime in somehow for some interaction as well. Okay, so we're going to get started. This webinar will be specifically targeted to internships and internship requirements, part of the CCC Maker. Once again, please feel free to submit your questions throughout the webinar, and the Q&A as well as the chat window will be monitored. Okay, so once again, internships, our names are there, and this is the third webinar from a series of about a dozen that we're going to be, half a dozen that we're doing, excuse me. And I think we have one scheduled up to next Monday, which I believe I have the updated schedule up in front of you. We did the introductory webinar and the work plans already. We're in the internships today. Tomorrow we'll do a little bit of equipment for makerspace design and considerations in that technology. Budget on Friday, and then next Monday we'll discuss a bit more about the Maker Faire event itself and some documentation, student documentation that we're asking in the presentation, with a couple of slides that you can prepare for the rest of the group and the rest of the community colleges to share out for that day. Okay, so that's coming up as well. So I'm going to get started because this particular topic is a bit lengthy and quite meaty. So I want to make certain that we have enough time here for questions at the end and keep the half-hour time frame to this webinar. So here are the outcomes that we're trying to achieve with this particular webinar. We're going to review once again the outcomes related to internships, the components of the internship as it relates to the CCC Maker initiative, and talk a little bit about what is work-based learning and how it is that we may want to consider it within the curriculum that is dispersed across several disciplines representing in our makerspace, in our makerspaces. And lastly, a little bit about badging and how that can be used to leverage to communicate to employers and students, and even as a process within the internship itself, and how you can develop the know-how, how you can develop a method to let the students to know when their opportunity to have an internship may be of some value to them once they accumulate enough badges and things of that nature. So I just want to review the due dates. I think I have an updated list here. So I wanted to just articulate them again. On May 12th, there is that celebration statewide meetup materials that are due. And this is the PowerPoint presentation itself. It's a three-slide PowerPoint. 17th is the implementation plan, both the plan itself and some of the narrative primarily. I did include there's a student activity documentation that will soon be, I believe it was sent out already, in terms of documenting some activities like a Maker Faire or a project done in a class. And there's several things that you can do for that. That'll be described a little bit later on. And of course, we're all reaching towards the Maker Faire and the grant application further along. Some of you already added Deborah and I to your Dropbox. So there was a question that came up with that. You have to set up your own Dropbox account. If you don't have one, please set it up. set up a folder, which will then you will share with Deborah and myself to submit your documents via that method. So there is no Dropbox folder that you're expecting from either one of us. It's a Dropbox folder on your side of the account that you then share with us. So that way you can then share that folder with the rest of your team if you're collaboratively working on various documents for this particular initiative. Okay, so once again, to reiterate, the 4 key outcomes that we're focusing on is the curriculum, community of practice, makerspace, and internships. We're going to focus on internships for this particular webinar, the makerspace a little bit more tomorrow, and the curriculum and community of practice, that's a bit more of the external processes and formative processes that really are going to take a bit longer to develop, but definitely will overlap, and you can see the activities that you may want to consider to submit for various aspects of your outcomes. In other words, there's going to be some activities that will suffice for both of these outcomes or for all 4 of them. According to this Venn diagram, there is an overlap, which many of these activities will actually fulfill all 4. And we'll talk a little bit about the work plan as it relates to thinking about this, and various activities will go across several outcomes. So here's a quick overview of the internship requirement as it relates to the CCC Maker project. So just to be clear, we're not using the Title V co-op requirements. That's the cooperative education workforce Title V requirements. This is not that. So some of you may be aware of those particular cooperative workforce education requirements that in some colleges exist, and you have to have a very formal structure for those type of requirements. We're not using that mechanism for these particular internships for the CCC Maker. As a matter of fact, this opportunity is closer to a student worker process where there's legalities that will help you place the student at the employer site because of the liability coverage being undertaken by the Foundation for Community Colleges. So it's not a Title V cooperative education program. The second thing is that there's going to be 1,000 interns that are meant to be placed through this initiative over these next 2.5 years, or really 2 years, as the time frame will probably be. So collectively, we have to join together as a group and see how we're going to fulfill this requirement across our state. This is quite a hefty sum of interns, but I think with the right planning, once we get with your implementation plans and grants going, we should be able to sort out how we can help develop this across our whole state. The second item is that there's 20 hours per student paid by the Foundation for Community Colleges through a program they call Career Catalyst. Now, these are separate funds. In other words, Sierra College, as the fiscal lead, is in contract with the Foundation for California Community Colleges and is essentially paying them to fulfill this particular outcome of the initiative. As part of the payment is also inclusive of the hours that will be paid to each student. The details about the hourly rate and those sort of items are going to be distilled down to the college level. So once you get in contact with the foundation and sort out some of the details for your particular college, the rate that you develop and the amount of funds that are dedicated are really just handled by the foundation itself. And so some of those details and nitty-gritty are really coming down until after we begin the implementation grants. But for now, you don't have to worry about sort of budgeting these particular funds in your work plan or budget. Just consider them that there's 20 hours that need to be fulfilled per student in your planning process. And I believe we already articulated in the previous webinar that in the startup packet that 50 interns per site is the stretch goal that we're trying to promote for each institution. The Foundation for Community Colleges is the employer on record. So this is how we assist in this process in making certain that there is a framework for the liability of the student, and the employer understands the student is covered through their insurance, and the foundation picks up that particular side of the coin. Now, this is sometimes a point of contention with institutions where we send students to employer sites, but the employer wants to make sure that the student is covered, either registered in a class or somehow covered by the institution. Well, you don't have to worry about that in this process where the student is actually being employed by the foundation and being paid by the foundation, and all liabilities carried by that, by this process. There has to be some employer and student college coordination, so there has to be some point of contact at each institution that will sort of handle the processes from the timesheet to the onboarding of students, the recording of employer hours that are being submitted. And if there's any issues regarding, student not showing up or anything like that, there should be someone that the employer should contact at the site and not have to contact the foundation for those sort of issues. Although there is some sort of communication to the foundation when it relates to the hours, but someone at the college should be prepared to help with that process. And lastly, another consideration is to use an e-portfolio for this consideration, since some students will have to apply for an internship, and it'd be good for them to have a digital version of the work accumulated. And there is a product out there called Portfolium that we'll send out once we start signing folks up for this process. Portfolium is a product that the California Community Colleges chose as a product that is free of charge to students and institutions that can be used as an e-portfolio solution. Some of you may use other e-portfolio solutions already. You don't have to change. It's just a process that we would highly recommend to help students formulate their application process for future internships. And also documenting potential badges in the future. Okay, so a little bit about internships themselves, since this is going to be possibly new to some of you. Some of you may be old news, but nonetheless, I wanted to make sure that we cover this. Internships is really part of a work-based learning structure, which is actually based on some pedagogical theory by Kolb. And the idea is that through experiential learning, there's a concrete experience that goes through a cycle that the student then does some reflection on, then sort of conceptualize it abstractly in terms of what does that mean to that individual, and then they do something about that experience. In other words, the motivation, the intrinsic motivation to then perpetuate another experience for their interest and reflect upon it, and then continue the cycle as it goes around and around. So the concept is based on, again, an intrinsic motivation and sort of an affective learning domain for students. And it's very much part of what a program of study should consider for many of our occupational goals that we have for our state and for this initiative. So for those of you interested, I encourage you to look into that a bit more. So because of the cyclic nature of work-based learning, there is a process that has been promoted by various, documented by many research-based initiatives across our state, the California Career Pathways Trust, Career Pathways, and other previous initiatives have promoted career readiness to be part of much of what we do. And what you see in front of you is the definition by NACCE in terms of what career readiness comprises of. And you can see there's 7 components of career readiness. And the process that you see here of awareness, exploration, preparedness, and then inevitably training is this progression through this Kolb cycle as students go through experiential learning. So in other words, you start with awareness of their career and their occupation through very sort of light experiences with employers like guest speakers or industry visits. And students become aware of occupations and skill sets that are necessary. Later on, they explore a little bit further with employer interviews possibly, or short job shadows to smaller groups where they visit an employer. And then inevitably, when students have something to show for this, where internships or an employer project or maybe a venture capital investment interview would come into play, where they're getting some feedback for all their work that they've done. So it's really where they're prepared to then receive some feedback at that point. And then inevitably, as they fine tune their skill sets, they go through capstone projects or enter a mentorship process where apprenticeships, for example, is the epitome of that particular spectrum of work-based learning. So you need to consider this in terms of a process from sort of very quick, light touch to employers in terms of their visits, and then all the way to much more deeper interaction with employers where they may be doing some of the training. We're going to try to hit the sweet spot, of course, with the internships right there where the preparedness arrow is at. Anyways, this is a really good methodology to follow. So there's a couple of internship options for us in this initiative that I wanted to cover, and there's 3 in particular that I'm going to go into. And sorry for the lengthy text on this PowerPoint. We make certain that we're going to send a Word document denoting these 3 options so that you can have them as reference beyond just this webinar. But it's very important that you consider these to be the options for yourself to direct your activities towards. The first option I'm going to describe is probably the most traditional one that most folks have in mind, and that's where the student develops an application based on some curriculum or an activity or a project completed within the scope of your CCC Maker project. So in other words, activities that you produce because of the CCC Maker project, funds that you may be using, equipment that you may be purchasing, workshops that you may be undertaking, anything that is within the CCC Maker project and the student produces something out of it. That particular application is then submitted to the employer, which then the employer selects the student based on whatever criteria they set forth. That's where the internship gets extended to the student and gets onboarded to the foundation's payroll after that selection. And at the conclusion of that internship, the employer then evaluates the student and provides feedback to the student and the college. Okay, so this is a light version of what the traditional internship program would be. We are asking for a 20-hour minimum for all of these opportunities because that's what's required as part of this initiative. Although I may recommend that you negotiate with the employer to either pay the student an additional 20 hours so that it's at least a 40-hour experience, and then possibly even supplement that on top of that with any funds that you may have at your institution for yet another 20 hours so that it becomes at least 60 hours of an internship. Again, those additional 40 hours are recommended, they're not required. But the reason why 60 hours may be of some interest to some of you is because 60 hours is typically the length of approximately a 1-unit internship credit, although again, they're not getting credit for this particular experience. It's a paid experience for students, but that gives it sort of some equality to probably what most involvements, if you have an internship program there, it's how much time a student would be involved in for 1 unit. So, all right, I'm going to answer, I think there's some questions coming in, and so definitely we're going to read some of those up if as folks get going. But let me cover the other 2 options so that you can see the breadth of the extent of this. Option number 2, we have an example where we provided some flexibility for those of you that may not be able to pair up 50 students to 50 employers over 2 years. That seems for some of us quite a bit of work. So another option to provide flexibility is to have employers set up a real-world problem and to pose it to a team of students. So about 3 or 4 students in a team, in which the instructor helps and assists in the development of a team solution for that real-world problem. So under the guidance of the instructor and makerspace personnel, the employer commits to spend a minimum of 20 hours outside of student class time, either at the makerspace ideally or at the employer site, but primarily at the makerspace, working directly with student teams and developing an evaluation of the design solution. So at the end, the employer gets to evaluate a team project, offers feedback, and talks about the process itself and how students collaborated across this project, and of course the product that is produced. So we did get this as an approved option for us, where obviously, because of the makerspace development in our institutions, it lends itself nicely to have students work in groups where sometimes maybe an employer may not have the flexibility to have certain equipment or technology at their site, or at least not for student use. And so this would be a very flexible method to increase the number of students that you have involved with employers in this initiative. And then lastly, the third option that we'll articulate is one where probably a student that did option 1 and 2 already. So the option number 3 is really possibly someone that is more advanced in your program that may have done already an internship or project in itself. But this is one where a student enters some sort of entrepreneurial training program by a small business development center, which are across many of our institutions, or any other economic development partner that offers workshops for some sort of startup process. So the idea is that students go through a lean launch business plan and develop clearly defined deliverables to launch a business venture. And the business venture plan, or the business plan, is submitted at the end of that workshop, where the student essentially, again, commits about 20 hours of work validated by the sponsor of a program. So it may not be an employer, but there's typically someone there that is undertaking the workshop or producing the workshop on behalf of some organization, and that the sponsor would validate that the student spent 20 hours in developing a business plan and presenting it to the group there. So that's the idea. The student would present and get feedback, obviously, to improve the process of launching his or her program, a project. So those are the 3 options of internships that are validated within this scope. There were other options considered, but we were not allowed to use any other options other than these 3 to count for this particular initiative. If you notice, all of them have a requirement of an external individual, either an employer or sponsor as an external entity. There has to be an evaluation process of the student, and again, a formative process for students to either get selected or be part of a project in a team, or be part of a workshop through an external party. So just to wrap up, because I'm looking at the time here, I want to make sure that we have time for questions. Here are some considerations for your internship development. How is your college onboarding students to the internship process? As described earlier, there is a work-based learning continuum you may want to consider developing to increase awareness of students so they can prepare for those internship opportunities. Another consideration is how you're implementing soft skill training to increase student success in those internships, as well as a success for employers, because you don't want to lose the collaboration of an employer because of a bad experience they may have underwent. And this is where you either want to consider embedding the curriculum of soft skills versus producing workshops like the 21st century badging workshop that we covered just recently. And then lastly, which badges are you developing to communicate to employers the preparedness of students? And so this is something that you may want to lay out for your planning to consider. These badges are important for students to obtain before they even apply to an internship. It's another way to develop this process. Some success factors that are for your consideration is make sure that you monitor how many hours you're planning before the students even apply to an internship. This is very critical, and linked to a successful internship is students who are just simply prepared for that experience. So monitoring the hours has been shown in some certain studies to be of high value to the outcomes of the student and the employer. Are you partnering with the Career Center or maybe a business intermediary to help you prepare students to apply for these internships? So that's something that within your internal structure, if you have assistance from additional elements in your institution or partnerships, you may want to make sure you either have them in place, or if you don't have them, consider them part of your planning process for this initiative to consider a contractual opportunity for such partnerships. Are you cultivating relationships with employers for the awareness and exploration piece before you get to the internship? And how are the evaluations of employers and students helping improve the program review of your either program of study or of the makerspace itself? And so many of you know that every year we have to develop program review documentation. And so collecting data of the evaluations of these internship processes may help not only you, but also help our CCC Maker initiative across our state. And I really suggest anyone in the chat box, if you want to put in any other success factors that you know of, please feel free to share. This is partly why we want to make certain that we're a community so that we can share out great best practices that all of us can share with one another and make this part of the initiative a successful venture for everyone. And don't forget, I'm going to just remind everyone that we did provide some examples in previous webinars about how you, within your logic model, you should have activities. We actually provided some that are directly aligned with internships in the previous webinar from yesterday. So I'm not going to cover them here, but they are located in your PowerPoints as examples of activities you may want to consider. And even the sample of the workflow to fill out your narrative up to budget. It includes some activities and performance outcomes. Again, you may want to consider for the internship itself. So I'll just place those as reminders. With about 5 minutes to go, I wanted to just quickly jump onto the Q&A and to the chat to maybe articulate some of these questions that may have not been answered. I know Deborah has been diligently catching up with a lot of us and your input, so I'm going to see how I can help in this regard. And Deborah, feel free to articulate any questions that you may want to answer verbally as well. So I'm going to read a couple of questions here. Do all internships need to have FCC as employer on record, or only if they are receiving the wages subsidies? And that is correct. If they're receiving the wage subsidies, in other words, if you want to make certain that they're getting paid outside your budget, then yes, they would have to go through FCC. Other than that, really, if you collect the employer's evaluation and student feedback on your own, really, that's completely up to you. So you can do the math. If every single particular college does 50 students for 20 hours, and let's say you pay them at minimum $12 an hour, that's about $12,000. So again, the subsidy that Sierra is providing for each side is approximately $12,000 to you. So if you want to offset that or pay that to something else, that's completely up to you, but I would recommend to take advantage of that subsidy. Another question that came in: what qualifies as an entrepreneurial training program as acceptable for the CCC Maker project? Do they have to have some kind of certification? The certification may be of the actual workshop itself, and a lot of them are set up that way. There's a kind of hours completed type of certification in a way. It's not a formal industry test that they have to undertake, but something that awards, a sponsor would award to the student. And consider that some of them may have a fee attached to them as well, where you may want to budget if a certain student has a great idea and you really feel that they should be part of an entrepreneurial program. That's something that you may want to consider in your budget to pay for that student to undertake that workshop. And although you may be paying for the workshop, the student will get paid for the experience and may offset in that regard. But this is really up to each and every one of you to consider the various options of that entrepreneurial training program. But again, minimum 20 hours, and it has to have some sort of sponsor, and they have to agree to sort of put in the hours completed that the student would fulfill. Another question was, how soon can we begin the internships? Good question. This summer, we're going to be doing some prototypes with the Foundation of California Community Colleges to really roll out this project really in full steam, quite frankly, in the fall. So at this moment, if you want to be part of a prototype group to work out all the details about the onboarding of employers, the whole payroll process, if you feel you want to be the guinea pig to work all those kinks out, and you're patient with all those details of bureaucracy, please let Deborah and I know, because we're looking for pilot groups to be able to work out the details for all this paperwork that really you don't have to take care of. It's really on the foundation end, but they need to develop the institutional knowledge to support the 1,000 interns. And so we're planning to, by the end of this summer, address to various colleges the way to onboard students as semester comes up online, and to have folks be onboarded this fall. Can the entrepreneurial program that the college offers, can it be on the college, I'm assuming, or does it have to be off-site? If the entrepreneurial program is sponsored by the college, like an SBDC, typically there's a director of an SBDC. It may be on the college, and so that individual will be the sponsor. So although it is on the college, it's not necessarily part of the college. How can I say? It's not a credit program necessarily. It works with outside partners primarily, and so physically it can be on the college, but you're hosting an SBDC on your college. So I think that may answer that question about SBDCs. Another question that came in was about the formal cooperative work experience education. Again, the credit. Again, this is not a credit experience for students, although it could be if you set it up that way. If you work within your structure and offer credit to students for some amount of hours and pay them for 20 hours or 20 additional hours beyond the credit, then that would be where you may have to creatively structure the credit side as well as the paid side, since there has to be somewhat distinct. I believe the student either gets paid across the whole amount of hours or partly. So you may have to separate what's credit versus what's paid. Yet the student may not necessarily, it may not affect them. They just have to fulfill more hours, obviously, and get credit for a certain amount of hours and get paid for the others. The employer needs to know that as well, because the employer can only house a student legally through federal labor law if the student obtains either credit or is getting paid. In this case, they're getting paid by the foundation as the employer on record to cover liability costs, which is important to the employer. So that's something that if those of you are considering coupling the credit and paid experience, we may have to do a very specific scenario for each one of you. It's a case-by-case basis. Okay, I'm looking at the questions. I know a lot of there's a question about, I see a couple of questions about 60 hours. Again, what's required is 20 hours per student for this initiative. Again, each student would have the 20 hours. If you give them more than 20 hours, they don't really count. We're really counting 1,000 individual students, to my understanding. So it's not, if you add more hours, it's not like you're fulfilling more of the commitment of your 50 students. So again, 20 hours minimum. Above that, it's optional, up to you. I would recommend to structure more than 20 just to make it worthwhile for the employer and student if you're considering more long-term, but it's not necessary. There was a question about if you pay for more hours with your own funding, must the internship be 60 hours or less? I think, again, if it's paid, they're essentially a paid employee. So there's no coupling to the 60 hours when it's actually paid because they're not receiving credit. Once you get into the credit side of the formula, there is some limitation. I believe the total limitation is 16 units, which is quite a bit, actually. So I don't think, only if you're having a very intense apprenticeship or employer training program may you probably reach the 16 units. But there is no limit how many hours you can pay the student beyond the 20. That's completely up to you. And of course, your funding. Okay, I know we're past the 12:30 mark. I think I looked at much of the questions that came in. If I didn't answer one of your questions, we're definitely want to make certain that we download the text from the chat and make sure that we sift through the questions to make certain that we addressed all of them as completely as possible. But I know some of you have to tune out because of the fact we reached the 12:30 mark already. I think we're past that. So I wanted to thank everyone for their participation in the second this week webinar. Tomorrow we'll talk a little bit more about technology and help you formulate the design of your makerspace in that realm. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Again, we're going to send out some more answers to these questions. And if so, just feel free to reach out to Deborah and myself for these particular details. Again, that really will be implemented more towards the fall, but this is meant to help you to plan for your makerspace involvement. Thank you very much, everyone, and you have a great afternoon.